Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chaosovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Milos, it's been another very eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
We'll be starting today's episode by covering the Middle East, where we got some potential de-escalatory news. The US and Iran actually held talks in Oman over Iran's nuclear program, and this is amid rising tensions following US forces shooting down an Iranian reconnaissance drone in the Arabian Sea. So we'll be covering that. Then shifting to the United States itself, the federal government reopened after a partial shutdown following commitments by the Trump administration to reduce the number of federal law enforcement officers in Minnesota. In the Indo-Pacific, the United States hailed a trade agreement with India following New Delhi's reported commitments to halt Russian oil purchases. And we also got the news that Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted foreign leaders for a new trading bloc regarding critical minerals. And then finally, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States held trilateral negotiations in Abu Dhabi, while Russia resumed strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure following a one-week stop in those bombings. So lots to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Milos. So let's start off this week as we have in recent weeks with the Middle East. If listeners will recall, in our last podcast, we highlighted the potential for significant military escalation between the US and Iran. And over this past week, we've seen a number of both diplomatic and security developments related to the US and Iranian relationship. So, Andrew, what can you update us first on the diplomatic front?
Yeah, all eyes on Iran this week, especially for the next 24 hours. There's quite a bit to talk about, but let's actually start in Oman, where U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's senior aide and son-in-law Jared Kushner have recently arrived in Muscat, where they are scheduled to begin key negotiations tomorrow morning, local time, with the Iranians. This was a meeting that I wouldn't say on again, off again, but almost didn't come to fruition whatsoever. There was the U.S. initially backed out of these talks very briefly, which were scheduled to be held the same day, but in Istanbul. And then there was a significant diplomatic effort behind the scenes, essentially of every major U.S. security partner in the Middle East advocating for this meeting, in fact, to take place, and for this meeting to take place in Muscat, specifically upon the request of the Iranians. So a few details about this meeting, what we can expect. The American diplomats are going into this, according to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, with the expectation that they will discuss not only Iran's nuclear program, which of course will be the priority issue, but also their conventional weapons programs, specifically their ballistic missile programs and production capacity, that sort of thing, as well as, to quote the Secretary of State, their support to terrorist networks across the region, by which, of course, he is referring to Iran's proxy network across the Middle East. Now, the contention there is that the Iranians have insisted, the last I've seen up until the night before the negotiations, that they are only willing to discuss their nuclear program, to which they do seem amenable to having fruitful, potentially productive dialogue with the United States. Turkey, for its part, obviously a major U.S. partner with quite a bit at stake in the outcome of these negotiations, is urging the United States to take a step back, address one issue at a time, and not go in with the expectation that they can solve all or even one of these problems during the summit tomorrow, but hopefully make progress towards at least the nuclear issue. Now, at the same time, there have been a number of security incidents directly related to this. So specifically, an American F-35 pilot shot down an Iranian drone that was, quote, aggressively approaching the USS Abraham Lincoln. That's according to a official statement from U.S. CENTCOM. On the same day, February 3rd, a U.S. oil tanker was approached by naval forces from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which threatened to board the vessel. The immediate response to that was a naval and air escort from the U.S. military. Again, these are two events, security events that happened at the tactical level that, because of the broader context that they are taking place in, really have the potential to spiral into significant escalation that can impact the strategic level. But that's the big picture for now, and we'll certainly know more as soon as tomorrow afternoon.
Right, and I should have mentioned up top, but we are recording this podcast on Thursday, February 5th in the late morning, Washington, D.C. time. So, those negotiations, as you mentioned, Andrew, between the U.S. and Iran in Oman will be very important to watch. But as you also discussed, there are still some quite significant levels of security and military activity happening in the backdrop of those talks. So we'll definitely update the situation in our next podcast next week. And then meanwhile, there's been some notable developments, both security and diplomatic, out of the Gaza theater. So what can you update us there?
Right, a very difficult week in Gaza. On the diplomatic front, the IDF announced the reopening of the Rafah border crossing, of course, in southern Gaza on the border with Egypt. The closure of it obviously had been a significant point of contention for the entirety of the war, and its reopening was a major point that the ongoing ceasefire deal sought to implement. That has now happened, at least officially. It remains to be seen to what extent both people and aid will be allowed to flow in and out. However, at the same time, while we are seeing incremental progress to the ceasefire implementation, there's quite a bit of fighting still going on the ground in Gaza. This week alone, at least 56 Palestinians were killed in a series of bombings, particularly on January 31st and February 4th, following direct clashes between Hamas and the IDF.
Got it. So we'll update that situation as well in our next podcast. But in the meantime, let's move on to the next global hotspot, which is the U.S. and the Americas. And turning back to you here, Milos, what can you update us on the U.S. domestic front?
Yeah, we got a bit of back and forth this week regarding the US government shutdown itself. So actually, last episode, we talked about how the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, actually struck a last-minute deal with the government that would see reduced funding for the Department of Homeland Security and, of course, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in return for keeping the government open. But as a result, or soon thereafter, we actually saw last weekend that there was a government shutdown as a result of some disagreement over the fine print, as it were. So over the week, it seemed that was there to stay. However, we did see increased pressure from the White House, notably first by inviting over Republican lawmakers who had actually been on board with this reduced budget, as it were, but then they came back. And that was rapidly followed towards the end of the week by quite a high number of Democratic lawmakers also deciding to reopen the government and to allow for the funding to restart. Now, that being said, despite the funding to the DHS continuing, we have seen some kind of middle ground being reached, or at least some reconciliatory tones from the Trump administration, who namely Trump himself came out saying that there was a need for and I'm quoting here, a softer touch on immigration enforcement. His border czar, as it were, Tom Homan, also announced that they were going to vastly reduce the amount of federal law enforcement officers, removing around 700 of them from the state of Minnesota, which leaves approximately 2,000 still in the state. But nevertheless, it looks like there was some kind of some deal struck either between the House and government itself, or whether this was a result of the protests that have still been going on. But it seems that, at least for now, the optics seem to suggest that the Trump administration wants to portray itself as listening to those concerns.
Got it. And elsewhere in the Americas, there's been some notable developments around Venezuela. So this week, at the beginning of the week, there was a delegation from the U.S. led by U.S. envoy Lara Dogu, who actually visited Caracas and met with the interim president Delcy Rodriguez of Venezuela. Notable diplomatic efforts there. And in the meantime, we've seen that there was reports of Venezuela's oil exports now having bounced back to some 800,000 barrels per day in January. And I should note that these are now under the control of the U.S. following that intervention to capture former President Nicolas Maduro by U.S. forces. And that's a significant uptick from 498,000 barrels per day in December. So we've seen that the U.S. has ended its blockade against oil shipments out of the country. And just some notable details here that the Treasury Department has authorized U.S. businesses to work with Venezuelan oil producer PDVSA, though we see that individual licenses are still in the process of being granted. And these numbers, this uptick in oil exports out of Venezuela, are in line with the deal that was struck between Washington and Caracas following Maduro's capture. So we can expect to see those oil exports likely continue. And also worth noting here that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who, with Russia having previously had a lot of economic and security ties with the former leader of Venezuela, Maduro, stating that Russian companies are being, quote unquote, forced out of the country following pressure from Washington. So we are seeing that uptick in oil exports, but still some notable tensions from Russia on this particular issue. And then rounding out the Americas, there's been some notable developments as well when it comes to the U.S. and other countries like Russia and China, particularly in Cuba and Panama. So what can you update us on that front, Milos?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the pressure from Washington, and that has indeed been the case here with Cuba, where President Trump signed an executive order which effectively designated Cuba as, and I'm quoting here again, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. He also declared a national emergency as a result, and this is largely due to the support that Cuba offers to some of the United States adversaries, though he didn't specify which ones. And so as a result, Trump has stated he would impose tariffs on imports from any country that supplies Cuba with oil. Obviously, it led to words of condemnation, not only from Russia, but also from China. And China was also quite, shall we say, irked by a decision made by Panama. Panama's Supreme Court actually ordered the removal of the license of a Hong Kong-based company, CK Hutchinson Holdings, in order for it to operate ports along the Panama Canal. And this is something that we covered a lot last year when this was one of the centers of gravity in the Americas between the United States and China vying for influence. Beijing condemned that decision, which came as a result of months of pressure from the United States against the country to essentially wean off a lot of Chinese influence, which is something that Trump said that was one of his priorities. So Beijing has now asked shipping companies to consider rerouting cargo through other ports, provided it doesn't result in significant extra costs, but certainly a point of contention. And we know that in the past couple of months, the US has been quite careful with resulting or making actions that could result in an angry response from China. So this is a bit of a departure from that, but certainly a center of gravity in the Americas that we're keeping an eye on.
Right. And speaking of China, let's now pivot to the Indo-Pacific, where there's been a lot of activity out of the US and China and a number of different countries in the region. So let's start off with some notable trade agreements out of the US reached in the Indo-Pacific this past week.
Yeah, so the big news this week was that the US had indeed reached a trade deal with India, and this was indeed quite notable given that over the past couple of months, leading towards the end of 2025, India was one of the few countries that didn't actually sign a trade deal with the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And this was as a result of the fact that the US was trying to get India to halt its purchases of oil from Russia, which in the past couple of months had led to an increase of tariffs up to 50%, so resulting in one of the highest tariff levels in the region. So we have heard signals over the past couple of months, the past couple of weeks, that there was efforts made for de-escalation, and clearly this seems to be the results. And US tariffs have now been scrapped from a total of 50% to around 18%, which puts India at levels of tariffs similar to its neighbors in Southeast Asia. Now, there are a few questions remaining on this deal. So the deal itself hasn't been signed. We got word this morning that from an Indian government minister saying that a likely timeline would be towards the end of, or the middle of end of March, that the deal would be signed, provided that some of the details get finalized. We don't, as of yet, have a confirmation from the Indian government that they have indeed stopped purchases from Russian oil. One can suspect that they might have agreed to reduce it, though it is quite a large market. It is still quite a heavy lift, as it were, from the Indians' perspective. So we'll have to see to what extent that commitment gets delivered. We also know that as part of this deal, which was largely announced by Trump, that the United States would see zero tariffs on its exports to India. And we'd also see Indian purchases of around $500 billion of American products over the course of the next 5 years. So we don't exactly know which products that is referring to, although the one thing we can guess at is that there have been a lot of orders placed for Boeing aircraft, so that is likely to make a large cut of that figure. But regardless of the details, this definitely marks a shift, at least in the diplomatic optics. These tensions that have been souring for the past half year, essentially, seem to now be reversing course slightly. India, despite a lot of public leaning towards Russia and China over the past couple of months, is likely to make steps now to try and regain a better relation with the United States. So I expect that within the next few weeks leading up to that mid-March deadline, we're going to be hearing more. So we'll be keeping you updated on that.
Got it. And in the meantime, there's been some related developments between the U.S. and China that bleeds into some of the issues that you've discussed. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so related to this India story, President Trump actually held a phone call with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And this was something that, again, President Trump reported on in a Truth Social post. And for the first time, the most remarkable thing was that this was the first time that he acknowledged talking about Taiwan with President Xi. This was something that, at least in public discussions and public negotiations, was a topic that wasn't really touched on for the past year, likely because the main subject of concern from the United States was reestablishing better trade relations with China. So it is an interesting development on that front. We know that President Xi on this front reportedly warned Trump to be prudent regarding the sale of weapons to Taiwan. This is in reference to the fact that the United States greenlit the largest sale of weapons to Taiwan back in, I believe it was December or November. But other than that, we know that from this Truth Social post as well, that Trump was getting the commitment from Beijing to up its purchases of United States-based soybeans from the current 12 million tons to around 20 million tons. So a potential signal to the rural base in America that an economic upturn is likely. And then just another item of note regarding China was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as Vice President J.D. Vance, who both hosted officials from a number of countries from Europe, Africa, and Asia on the signing of a new trading bloc with the aim of stabilizing the supply chains and the costs of critical minerals. This is all part of the United States' efforts to diversify away from China's basic monopoly on the supply chains of rare earths and critical minerals. Notable absence was there weren't any representatives of Greenland or Denmark present, despite the rhetoric concerning the critical mineral deposits on the island. But yeah, this is overall a step forward. We've been hearing a lot about the United States wanting to diversify, and this is a potential leap forward in that respect. We have yet to hear exactly the numbers and the figures regarding this, but for now it seems that these countries are on board and willing to work with the United States on this front.
Gotcha. So let's move on to our last global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So turning back to you here, Andrew, some very notable diplomatic activity this past week related to the conflict. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so over the course of yesterday, February 4th, and today, the 5th, there's a series of trilateral talks hosted in Abu Dhabi between, of course, Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. The second day of those talks wrapped up just a couple hours ago at the time of recording. I haven't seen too much yet about the details of those outcomes. What we know for sure is that Ukraine and Russia agreed to conduct a POW exchange, exactly 314 personnel from each side. That exchange has now taken place. I will note that happened within hours of that deal being announced. I expect that within the next day or two, we will get some more details over exactly whether or not the needle was moved in these discussions. It was never going to be the case that the parties come out of these talks and these specific series of talks in Abu Dhabi with a ceasefire deal. However, all sides going in did have a positive tone based off of another series of talks that preceded this just the week before. Of course, the two issues that are preventing a ceasefire deal right now or a permanent end to the war remain the control of the Donbass territory, specifically the 20% that Russia currently does not occupy, as well as the future control of the Zaporizhia region. So again, that's not the kind of thing we're going to see a deal reached over the course of 48 hours, but it is plausible that we'll see some positive details in terms of moving the ball down the field and securing a ceasefire or perhaps a permanent truce out of this meeting.
Right, and I should note, as usual, that there are still military actions and activities taking place. For Russia conducted bombings against numerous Ukrainian cities this week, and also actually resumed its bombardment against Ukraine's energy infrastructure following a week-long pause at the request of U.S. President Trump for a temporary ceasefire. So even as we're seeing some diplomatic progress there does continue to be some level of security actions and activity continuing. And just very briefly, Andrew, since you've already touched on some of the diplomacy happening, what can you update us on over the conflict?
Yeah, it's common at these high-level, high-stakes summits that states will take the opportunity to negotiate on other key issues on the side. That was certainly the case over these last 2 days in Abu Dhabi. So as these trilateral talks were going on, the START treaty, that is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between Russia and the United States, expired yesterday without a plan to renew it. It is now, again, at the time of recording, there will probably be updates on this within the next day or so. But the treaty has officially expired. The treaty stipulated that both Russia and the United States were to cap their strategic nuclear arsenal at 1,550 deployed warheads apiece. The latest we've seen on that, and again, I haven't seen any details come out of this beyond this announcement, but both the Russians and the American diplomats present in Abu Dhabi are confident that they are, quote, closing in on the extension of the START treaty. So that's certainly a big one. I do think that we will, as opposed to the war in Ukraine itself, it is very much possible that we could see significant progress on this particular issue coming out of the talks this week.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.